border barrier. He could do whatever he wanted with it, which shows an advantage. But the question was, would the president add something with that? Would he declare a national emergency? I just got off the phone with Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff, and the answer is a resounding yes. And for the first time, you're going to hear exactly how much it is and where the money's coming from. It's going to be about $8 billion. He had the 1.3, then $600 million will come from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. $2.5 billion out of DOD. They consulted with Mick Mulvaney and the White House over the last few months on what they could actually do, and they're going to use some money they feel they can spare on the drug interdiction account. Then they came across with $3.5 billion for the military construction budget. They feel they can help in that respect. And then, of course, they have additional money. It all adds up to $8 billion. So the 1.375, not enough for the president. He wanted 5.7. He walks away at the end of the day with $8 billion. And, of course, the Democrats and some Republicans are upset about that. Now, let's go to Capitol Hill. Now, earlier today, we understand, David Spun, that the Senate voted with 83 yeses to pass this bipartisan bill. What could you tell us about the House tonight?
Yeah, Brian, 83-16. It has been a very busy day here on Capitol Hill. The House is getting ready to vote on this final passage here. Sometime in the next hour and a half, 2 hours, we are expecting this to be a resounding yes if you talk to Democrats. That's what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says. Now, after the House votes on this, it's going to go over to the White House. You mentioned you spoke to Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, President Trump, the rest of his team ready, anxiously awaiting to see the final tally, see this final legislation. Now, Senator Mitch McConnell, he's the majority leader. He made sure that he had assurances from the White House today that President Trump would indeed declare a national emergency for that $1.37 billion border barrier, enough for 55 miles of fencing along the Texas-Mexico border. Now, there are several provisions. Now, one of them, Brian, out of the many provisions, is that the Department of Homeland Security, they'll have to discuss any construction with local leaders before that construction takes place. But the big news here right now is the House. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said today she is confident this will pass in the House. We're going to stand by, bring you any other updates. Brian.
David, we'll go back to you, especially if that vote actually takes place, and maybe some people change their vote when they hear about the president's declaration of a national emergency, which is official, will be signed tomorrow. I'd like to now go out to Congressman Chip Roy. The Republican is on the floor getting some of this news. Now, Congressman, I understand you are not thrilled with the additional funds that the president is going to be declaring tomorrow. Why?
Well, hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on. You know, look, my primary concern here is that the Congress hasn't done its job. They've left the president having to figure out how to handle this and how to secure the border of the United States, which is fundamentally our duty as a sovereign nation. He shouldn't be in that position. But if the president signs this bill, this very bad bill, then I believe he might actually undermine the very emergency that he's trying to declare. Congress has not done its duty. We've now sent him up a bill which actually makes it impossible to build fencing along the Rio Grande Valley and public lands, impossible to build the fencing where there might be some objections from some local officials. Meanwhile, McAllen is where we've got 400,000 people streaming across our border, bringing fentanyl into our country and bringing little children into our country to be used as hostages by the cartels. This bill has a provision in it, Section 224, which will empower the cartels to use children and to make sure that they're protecting people here who are here illegally as their sponsors, as the bill says. That is unconscionable, and I'm just really frustrated that this is what Congress is sending to the president. I hope he will actually reject it and veto it.
Wow. So there are some provisions in a 1,000-page-plus bill that you didn't have 72 hours to review. You nixed that. As people read it, they're starting to see some poison pills, which makes me wonder how anyone Republican could be upset that the president's going to get an extra $8 billion in emergency funds. Congressman, interesting vote. We'll see how it goes. We'll check back with you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
All right, let's go out to Kansas. Chris Kobach, as former Kansas Secretary of State, ran for Senate, almost won that. Governor, excuse me. Chris, we spoke on Fox and Friends this morning, and you said, I got to look at these 1,000 pages to see if some poison pills. You heard the congressman. Do you see some provisions in here that the president's not going to be happy about?
Yes, I do. I agree with Congressman Roy completely. Section 224 is a de facto amnesty. Anybody who can claim to be a potential sponsor of an unaccompanied alien minor, and we've got about 223,000 such individuals who've been let into this country, A potential sponsor can be a distant relative. You know, so you played out the numbers. It's probably going to be upwards of 1 million people who are going to claim this protection from removal. They can't be deported, according to this bill, if they're even in the household of a potential sponsor of an unaccompanied alien child. It's a disastrous provision. There's also a provision that says the president can't impose any border fees on crossings. That's one way he was going to make Mexico pay for the wall, is impose a fee on people coming in from Mexico. Well, the bill doesn't allow him to do that. So I blame the the Republican negotiators for putting him in this really bad position. He needs the $1.3 million to build the wall, but he's got these poison pills attached to it, and they really shouldn't have put the president in this position.
Well, it's true. So you got the bill, and then you have tomorrow the president's going to be signing he's going to actually declare a national emergency. It's been done 58 times since the law went into effect and giving the president his power since 1976. So will that solve a lot of these problems?
Well, yes and no. The national emergency will empower the president to free up additional funds to spend on building the badly needed border wall. And I just came last week from the Arizona border where it's wide open in many places. We absolutely need it. We need to be building immediately. But what happens with the bill is that those funds become available immediately. There is a chance when the Democrats and their allies take this to court, the national emergency, that if they draw lucky and get a judge who is an activist and wants to see the president's wall project stopped, that judge might enjoin the use of these additional funds that come from the national emergency. So he needs that $1.3 billion to get started immediately. We'll see. But obviously, the president is looking for money everywhere to make good on his #1 promise that he made to the American people to build that wall. So, you know, I know where he's coming from here. He wants to stay faithful to that promise, and he sees the incredible emergency we have on our southern border. And like I say, just coming from the border recently, it's happening every day, and it is a big problem.
You know, and keep in mind, President Obama did 12 of these national state emergencies. He did the same thing with DACA, and so far the Supreme Court has not even taken that up yet. Maybe this will be on a fast track. In the meantime, the president could possibly spend the money. Chris Kobach, you're all over this. Thanks so much for reading the 1,000 pages. We'll see if it passes the House today.
Almost my pleasure.
Almost your pleasure, right? Let's go out to Mark Stein for some deep thoughts. Mark, after the president made it clear today that he's going to be declaring using emergency funds, immediately Nancy Pelosi came out and said, well, okay, maybe a Democratic president will decide guns. There's too many guns in this country. Will declare a state of emergency. That would not apply to this provision. But what do you think the ramifications are of the president doing this?
Well, I think it's difficult with guns because guns are in the Constitution. I'm not sure it would be so much more difficult if she wanted to do something on, say, climate change and the Green New Deal and that kind of thing. So I do share the concerns of people about having to actually police one's national frontier through an emergency measure. And I think actually, just to go back to what Chris Kobach was saying, Brian, I think we all know the first judge the Democrats lay this in front of, whichever rinky-dink district court judge in the 9th Circuit they decide to give the gift of this emergency, national emergency to, he is going to order a stay on it. And then we get to the stuff that's in the bill, this hideous bill, where it actually gives a veto to municipalities as to whether any border wall can be constructed. There are a lot of huge problems here, and most of them arise because the Republicans, when they control Congress, didn't get this done in the first 2 years.
Right. It is strange. They only gave him 1.6, and they only offered him that even in the second year when Paul Ryan was in charge. And we're splitting the screen, Mark, for a very good reason. I know you like usually your face on the whole screen, but we're doing it for a very good reason. We're watching the vote and the speeches come out of the House. Normally the House would vote first, but because of the funeral today, they asked for the Senate to go first. In the big picture, the president sits there and negotiates in a bipartisan way. Many people feel as though the Democrats got more than the Republicans. Fine. But this $8 billion should keep many conservatives happy, knowing that the president continues to fight and trying to fulfill a promise. Would you buy that?
Well, I think we need some clarity on what the bill actually says, because some of this stuff about, again, the language that Chip Roy was talking about, potential sponsors, that appears to incentivize human trafficking. I don't know why the Democrats are in favor of that. but the Republicans certainly shouldn't be.
All right, Mark, thanks so much. Again,
Thanks
Mick
a lot,
Mulvaney
Brian.
just called us. You got it. $600 million will come from Treasury, $2.5 billion from DOD drug interdiction, $3.5 for military construction budget, and that'll get you to about $8 billion. That'll build a lot of wall and bring a lot of security. Let's see what happens over the next 24 to 48 hours as we continue to watch that vote in the House. In the meantime, while we watch that, coming up next in a couple of minutes, Tucker Carlson takes on the issues like Andy McCabe and his new book and accusations. Later on, China, Marco Rubio, his greatest concerns as we try to reconfigure our trade relationship. Don't miss a minute.
You've heard people who seem a little paranoid, to be honest, talk about a coup. Now they don't seem quite as crazy. In a new interview, former FBI Deputy Director Andy McCabe admitted that Justice Department officials discussed launching an administrative coup d'etat against the President of the United States. The official, says McCabe, considered asking the President's cabinet to invoke the never-invoked 25th Amendment to the Constitution as a way to remove Trump from power, obviously without an election or an impeachment hearing. Fox Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is on the story and has details for us tonight. Catherine?
Well, thank you, Tucker. McCabe went on the record confirming our reporting from October that he believed the Justice Department's second in command was serious about recording the president and invoking the 25th Amendment. The timing matters because May 2017 is a pivotal month in the Russia probe. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein was just 2 weeks into the job when President Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. 8 days later, Rosenstein appointed the special counsel. McCabe also tells CBS News that after Comey was fired, the FBI launched an obstruction of justice case, in addition to the FBI's ongoing investigation into alleged Russia collusion. In a statement, the Justice Department seemed to stop short of denying Rosenstein talked about removing the president. Quote, the Deputy Attorney General never authorized any recording that Mr. McCabe references. Based on his personal dealings with the president, there's no basis to invoke the 25th Amendment. In a tweet, President Trump hit back, disgraced FBI Acting Director Andrew McCabe pretends to be a poor little angel, when in fact he was a big part of the crooked Hillary scandal and the Russia hoax, a puppet for lying James Comey. And for some context, Andrew McCabe was fired last year for lying to federal investigators. That case is now with the U.S. Attorney here in Washington. Tucker.
Catherine Herridge for us. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. John Summers is a former communications director for Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, and he joins us. And John, thanks very much for coming on.
You bet.
So take the party IDs off the players in this. Here you have federal law enforcement discussing removing a president without an impeachment or an election. That sounds like something that happens in a third world country, doesn't it?
Well, it's something, and I'm not going to defend any one individual in this situation, because these are very serious conversations that they were having. But it does appear that those are conversations they were having.
Yes.
And those are based off of the Constitution, right? It's the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, which does act as a safeguard should we ever run into that situation. So for me,
run into what situation?
Run into a situation
where you don't like the president or disagree with his Russia policy,
or where you feel like the president is incapable of doing the job. And so I think I don't have a problem that they had these discussions. At the end of the day, they landed at no. And I think that's the important thing to remember. So the system worked the way it was supposed to as it relates to whether or not to remove the president.
No, because if you find yourself as an executive branch employee disagreeing with the policies of the person for whom you work, you leave, you quit. And you can state so publicly if you want. You have the right to do that. What you're not allowed to do is try to take power from the one elected guy in the entire branch of government, because that's not democratic. It's the opposite of democratic. But that's what they tried to do.
Agreed. But what you're saying is that they were considering it because they didn't like the policies. And I don't think that's the case at all.
Why were they considering it?
There's a genuine concern about how Russia was involved in the 2016 election.
Okay, but so the amendment was written after Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke in office and his wife wound up running the country. I guess she was a fine president, but we didn't want to repeat repeat that. So this was specifically written, and every lawyer knows this, including the ones at the FBI, for a president who's incapacitated, not for a president whose policies you find repugnant or disagree with or don't. You know what I mean? Just because he's not a neocon doesn't mean that you can remove him from power.
I agree. And again, I don't think that's what they were thinking about. There was big concern. Again, when you look at the timing of McCabe going into office, and again, he's obviously a flawed messenger in many ways, but when you look at the time that he was elevated to his position was right after James Comey was fired. And why was James Comey fired? As the president said himself, because he wanted the Russia investigation to end.
Okay, but
clearly there was a concern.
But the other way, well, there was a concern because a guy they liked who was their boss got fired, which is absolutely the prerogative of this or any president to fire his own employees if he wants, for whatever reason he wants. And if you don't like it, impeach him or vote against him.
Unless it's viewed as obstruction of justice.
Okay, but but under no plausible scenario could it be. I mean, because of course the FBI director is free to say whatever he wanted to congressional committees or the Mueller investigation or write a book, which indeed he did. So it's not obstruction of justice. It's not going to prevent justice from working its way to its conclusion. I just wonder, why are liberals all of a sudden defending this radically empowered federal law enforcement agency? You don't see this as a threat to the Kamala Harris administration 2 years from now, for real?
Yeah, no, and I get the question. I don't see liberals defending this. I think what we're defending is protecting the investigation. So we have a good understanding of exactly what Russia was doing in the 2016 elections and whether they were aided by anyone here in the United States. And part of that question centers on the President of the United States and some of his closest associates.
But we've spent 2 years looking into that, and the conclusion of the Senate committee that's looked into it is there's no collusion.
That's not true. That's what the chair of that committee said. That wasn't a statement from the committee as a whole. Okay. That's what the chair said.
Is there a point at which
the ranking member, just to be fair, the ranking member said he disagreed. So
the ranking member did not say that.
And official court documents have come to the conclusion that there was some collusion. We saw that in Manafort documents, and we've also seen it in the Roger Stone documents. Whether that collusion rises to the president is the question.
Okay, just for the record, there's no, quote, collusion with Russia in the Roger Stone indictments. Okay, no one has been indicted for colluding with anybody so far.
Acting as a liaison between WikiLeaks on behalf of the Russia.
But that is not, look, it's not a crime and it's not collusion. But leaving that aside, I just want to end on this. Does it really honestly, as a citizen, not bother you that a federal law enforcement agency discussed removing the President of the United States by non-democratic means for basically disagreeing with them and firing their boss? That doesn't bother you at all?
The premise of your question, if that was the case, would bother me. That's not what that was about.
How about let's leave the last part off. Whatever it was about.
I'm comforted by the fact that they had the discussion as provided by the 25th Amendment, and they landed on no. So again,
it's like saying, I talked about killing my wife. I didn't do it. You know what I mean? And there's a difference. Like, I'm not a murderer. It's like, oh, yeah, but you discussed it. What does that say about you? Something ominous, no?
What it says, it's less about the people and more about the concerns they have about the president who's trying to stop an investigation into his campaign. If he's got nothing to hide, he should have nothing to fear.
Okay. Give me your email password if you've got nothing to. We'll talk about it off air. John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In his 60 Minutes interview, McCabe admits that his attempt to undermine the president began almost immediately after his boss, Jim Comey, was fired. And it was, of course, due to Russia.
I was speaking to the man who had just run for the presidency and won the election for the presidency, and who might have done so with the aid of the government of Russia, our most formidable adversary on the world stage. And that was something that troubled me greatly.
How long was it after that you decided to start the obstruction of justice and counterintelligence investigations involving the president?
I think the next day I met with the team investigating the Russia cases, and I asked the team to go back and conduct an assessment to determine where are we with these efforts and what steps do we need to take going forward.
Alan Dershowitz is a retired Harvard Law School professor. He's the author of the book, The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks very much for coming on. So now the suspicions of many are confirmed by one of the players in it. The Department of Justice discussed trying to remove the president using the 25th Amendment. What's your reaction to that?
Well, if that's true, it is clearly an attempted coup d'etat. relating to what your former guest said, let's take the worst case scenario. Let's assume the President of the United States was in bed with the Russians, committed treason, committed obstruction of justice. The 25th Amendment simply is irrelevant to that.
Right.
That's why you have an impeachment provision.
Exactly.
The 25th Amendment is about Woodrow Wilson having a stroke. It's about a president being shot and not being able to perform his office. It's not about the most fundamental disagreements. It's not about impeachable offenses. And any Justice Department official who even mentioned the 25th Amendment in the context of President Trump has committed a grievous offense against the Constitution. The framers of the 25th Amendment had in mind something very specific, and trying to use the 25th Amendment to circumvent the impeachment provisions or to circumvent an election is a despicable act of unconstitutional power grabbing. And you were right when you said it reminds me of what happens in third world countries. Look, these people may have been well-intentioned. They may believe that they were serving the interests of the United States, but you have to obey the law, and the law is the Constitution. And the 25th Amendment is as clear as could be. Incapacity, unable to perform office. That's what you need. That's why you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate agreeing, and it has to be on the basis of a medical or psychological incapacity, not on the basis of even the most extreme crimes, which there's no evidence were committed. But even if they were, that would not be a basis for invoking the 25th Amendment.
So this is not simply right.
And I challenge any left-wing person to get on television and to defend the use of the 25th Amendment. I challenge any of my colleagues who are in the Get Trump at Any Cost camp to come on television and justify the use of the 25th Amendment other than for physical or psychiatric incapacity.
I bet they're doing that right now. But this is an attack on our system, I would say, not just on the president. Alan Dershowitz, thank you very much.
It's an attack on our system, and it's an attack on the Constitution. Thank you.
Scary. We have an update for you tonight on language in the border security bill. One part of that bill says essentially that illegal immigrant families can pick up illegal immigrant children from federal custody, and that DHS will not be notified of that. Any language added to the bill is there for a reason, and the reason here is very clear. It will make it easier for children coming from Central America to be aided by illegal immigrants here in the United States. Now, this may be motivated by goodwill. We could debate it. But in effect, it creates a harmful incentive. It will encourage more children to make the long and dangerous trek up through Central America to the United States. We'll continue to stay on top of the details of this bill because they're worth paying attention to.
Breast cancer is the leading cause of all cancer deaths for Hispanic women.
That's unacceptable. Breast cancer is unacceptable.
Join our fight. Save lives.
Failure is unacceptable. Together with Susan G. Komen, we're committed to reducing U.S. breast cancer deaths by half.
We're going to do it.
Factory workers, your local beat cop. Republicans were the party of lawyers and doctors. They spent a lot of time at country clubs, remember? Things have changed a lot. Now Democrats have become the party of the elite professional class. They're consultants, iBankers, socialites, eager to lecture you about open borders, global warming from their gated communities. Nobody knows that change better or has watched it more carefully than the author of Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance. We spoke to him recently about it. J.D. Vance, thanks for joining us. So, because you don't live in Washington and you think bigger thoughts than the rest of us who are completely consumed by this dumb news cycle, I want to ask you a broader question. The parties have realigned. They don't represent the same people they thought they represented or that they have represented for the last 70 years. I'm not sure their leaders understand this, but you do. Who do the parties represent as of right now?
Well, at a big level, the Democratic Party increasingly represents professional class elites.
Yes.
And Republicans represent middle and working class wage earners in the middle of the country. Now, I will say, I think Democratic leaders kind of get this. If you look at the big proposals from the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates, universal child care, debt-free college, even Medicare for All, which is framed as this lurch to the left, but is really just a big handout to doctors, physicians, pharmaceutical companies, and hospitals, they sort of get that they're the party of the professional class, and a lot of their policies are geared towards making life easier for professional class Americans. The problem I have is that my party, the Republican Party, hasn't quite figured out that we basically inherited a big chunk of the old FDR coalition. The middle of the country, working and middle class, blue collar folks, the sort of people who work, pay their taxes, send their kids to the military. That's increasingly the base of the Republican Party, but the Republican donor elites are actually not aligned with those folks in a lot of ways, and so there's this really big mismatch, big picture within the Republican Party.
So I'm completely fascinated by what you just said, something I've never thought of in my life, that Medicare for All is actually a sop to the professional class. That's a whole separate segment, and I hope you'll come back and, and unpack that all. But more broadly, what you're saying, I think, is that the Democratic Party understands what it is and who it represents and affirmatively represents them. Yes. They do things for their voters, but the Republican Party doesn't actually represent its own voters very well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, look at who the Democratic Party is. And look, I don't like the Democratic Party's policies. Most of the times I disagree with them. But I at least admire that they recognize who their voters are, and they actually, just as raw, cynical politics, do a lot of things to serve those voters. Now look at who Republican voters increasingly are. They're people who disproportionately serve in the military, but Republican foreign policy has been a disaster for a lot of veterans. They're disproportionately folks who want to have more children. They're people who want to have more single-earner families. They're people who don't necessarily want to go to college, but they want to work in an economy where, if you play by the rules, you could actually support a family on one income. Yes. Have Republicans done anything for those people really in the last 15 or 20 years? I think you can point to some policies of the Trump administration. Certainly instinctively, I think the president gets who his voters are and what he has to do to service those folks. But at the end of the day, the broad elite of the party, the folks who really call the shots, the think tank intellectuals, the people who write the policy, I just don't think they realize who their own voters are. Now, the slightly more worrying implication is that maybe some of them do realize who their voters are. They just don't actually like those voters.
Well, that's it. So I watch the Democratic Party, and I notice that if there's a substantial block within it, it's this unstable coalition of all these groups have nothing in common. But the one thing they have in common is the Democratic Party will protect them.
Yes.
You criticize a block of Democratic voters, and they're on you like a wounded wombat. They'll bite you. The Republicans watch their voters come under attack and sort of nod in agreement. Yeah, these people should be attacked.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, if you talk to people who've spent their lives in D.C., I know you live in D.C.
Yes.
I've spent a lot of my life here. The people who spend their time in D.C., who work on Republican campaigns, who work at conservative think tanks. Now, this isn't true of everybody, but a lot of them actually don't like the people who are voting for Republican candidates these days. And if you ultimately boil down the never Trump phenomenon, what is the never Trump phenomenon? I was very critical of the president in the campaign. But the never Trump phenomenon, I think, is primarily not about the president. It's about the people who are most excited about somebody who was anti-elitist effectively taking over the Republican Party. They recognize that Trump was, whatever his faults, a person who instinctively understood who Republicans needed to be for. And at the end of the day, I think they don't necessarily want the Republican Party to be for those folks. They don't like the policies that will come from it. They don't like necessarily the country that will come from it. And so there's a lot of vitriol directed at people who voted for Donald Trump, whether excitedly or not.
If the Republican Party has a future, it'll be organized around the ideas you just laid out, maybe led by you or someone who thinks like you. I'm serious. That's what it needs, I think. J.D. Vance, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
It is time for Final Exam. The remarkable Lauren Blanchard going tonight for her 8th win in a row. The question is, have you paid closer attention than she has to this week's news? Find out after the break.